the role of sort of imagination. And I think just the role of dreaming, I think, is very overlooked. But I feel like that's also very culturally contextualized. The imagination of an American is probably vastly different from the imagination of, indigenous folks that you work with. The thing to kind of prod there is, what are some of the dreams or things that you see coming from more indigenous populations regarding climate adaptation?
From the indigenous perspective, it's just like the principle of respect, towards nature, and not having, that kind of, okay, we're just going to bulldoze this whole habitat that's, for koalas so we can build a car park. It's very much about how do we make these decisions so that we live with nature. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about. It is the role of how do we then blend these different imaginations in these kind of public forums where I've spoken, for instance, at the COP28 in Dubai. That was one of the conversations. It's like different countries, different cultures have different imaginations. Like, how do we bring those together? And I think for me, it's always when I look at future images of cities for instance, with Midjourney, I do see, there's clean water, like healthy ecosystems. There's particular things I feel like that are universal. And then whatever elements there are, might be culture specific, kind of the balance, living and imagining a balance and respect towards ecosystems. I think that's definitely something that I feel we need to bring into these conversations. And you're absolutely right. The role of imagination is overlooked in so many times. And even in climate adaptation, we do this stakeholder workshops and talk about climate change scenarios in the future. And somehow the basic expectation or assumption is that every person in that room shares the same imagination, and that every person who's in that room will see the kind of world in a similar way. It says we just give them a scenario and then they just come up with solutions. Whereas I think more realistically, we are not kind of going through that first process of values and also having a discussion. Well, what does that world look like to you where you would feel that you would be thriving? And that's why Resilience Frontiers has been really, really important globally as well, because it is, challenging us to reimagine the world, but in a way that, we actually focus on the thriving rather than the kind of, negative views. And in these climate negotiations, so we've run the Resilience Lab a few times, and I just remember in one of the negotiations, so we asked two questions. So first question was, what does the world look like when it's 2040 and we have failed? And every person in that lab put their hand up and said, oh, let me tell you, there is no water. All the ecosystems were destroyed. They all had an answer. And then I flipped the question and I said, okay, what does the world look like 2040 when we have aced all the SDGs, when we have achieved this kind of balance with nature? What does the thriving future look like? No hands. And I think that to me is scary, because I feel like that's where the kind of gap in imagination is. And I'm super passionate, and it's something that I'm more and more interested to research. It's like how do people imagine the future, and how does that alone kind of impact what we think is feasible or what we should be doing with climate adaptation?
I love that.
Yeah, this turns me straight back to the conversation we had with Ryan, Charlie. So for you, Johanna, I guess this is something you've probably also seen in your work. That conversation was mainly based around human behavior, and everything comes back to what's your learning history. And I think now we have this communal general learning history that is this nihilistic view that Charlie described at the beginning. And if we don't start to change that worldview, it's difficult for people to imagine what a nice world could be.
One of the really impactful books I read last year was Artificial Wisdom by Tom Weaver. And it's about a world in 2050, a world government that's about to happen, but it's all also describing the world. And I'm so interested in how movies and documentaries how they do the world building. And I think that's really interesting because I'm always like a massive advocate for books. And I know my mentor always says you need to stop reading and start writing. But I'm like, I think books and movies in particular, like that's when people go to relax. And I think that's where you have one of the biggest kind of leverage points for impact.
Get them when they don't expect it.
Yes.
Yes, Tom, make it as ominous as possible.